Dr. Rogers is a professor of conservation biology at the Department of Zoology and a fellow of Somerville College, University of Oxford. He obtained his first degree in marine biology and a PhD in the genetics and taxonomy of marine invertebrates at Liverpool. As you can read in the brochure, his career and interests are extensive and diverse. 3 years ago, I contacted Dr. Rogers requesting further information about biodiversity at hydrothermal vents, and he suggested this think tank. So here we are today. Thank you.
Thanks, William. First, I've got to thank William for bringing this meeting together. As he said, he contacted me about 3 years ago, and when he started to discuss what his interest was, it was kind of an irresistible topic for me to suggest a meeting for. So here we are. I'm kind of, I guess, in deep water in a number of ways. This is totally outside my normal scope of work, but I'll just get on with it. Interestingly, I seem to have been thinking along similar lines to Chris during the preparation of this talk. So these are hydrothermal vents. These are high temperature hydrothermal vents on the East Scotia Ridge in Antarctica. The depth here is about 2.4 kilometres. And what you can see here is hot fluid coming out the seabed. It's hitting cold seawater, and you're seeing precipitation of metal sulfides, which is forming this black smoke-like phenomena above the chimneys. And you can see some life here. These are crabs. They're about 17 centimetres in length, crawling around. You can see here within tens of centimetres of this fluid, which is at a temperature of about 386 degrees C. So how these vents formed? Well, essentially seawater penetrates the Earth's crust, probably through fractures on a mid-ocean ridge or on an ocean ridge in this case. It ends up in a subsurface aquifer and comes into contact with very hot rock. And what you get at that point is a very complex chemical exchange between seawater and those heated rocks. So you end up with a fluid which has been stripped of oxygen. It's acidic, contains high concentrations of sulfur in the form of sulfides, metals, helium, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on. If the temperatures exceed boiling point of the fluid at that particular depth or pressure, then we can see phase separation in these fluids, where we end up with a very vapour-rich and brine phase in that fluid. And you can see that enrichment here. This is hydrothermal fluid. Sorry, you might need a telescope to see this if you're up at the back. And this is hydrothermal fluid versus seawater. And these are some of the really important molecules in terms of life around hydrothermal vents. You can see here that these hydrothermal fluids are very enriched in hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen and methane, but also a whole range of metals you can see here and various other things. By the same token, they actually have less sulfate and magnesium than normal seawater. And of course, these reduced chemicals are very important for life around hydrothermal vents. And this was where the real excitement about these ecosystems was generated after 1977, when they were first found by, I guess, deep sea geologists, really looking for heat, escape of heat around mid-ocean ridges. So you can see here in many cases the metabolic reactions that microorganisms use around hydrothermal vents are based on oxidation of things like methane and hydrogen sulfide using oxygen. But there are many other reactions as well where the electron acceptor is something different. For example, methanogenesis, where the electron donor is hydrogen and the acceptor is carbon dioxide. So in the context of discussions today, these are probably sort of more interesting metabolic pathways. Most chemosynthetic bacteria actually use their carbon source CO2, but some fix carbon from carbon monoxide and methane. And the important thing to bear in mind about vents, and this is not a picture of what I think life is going to look like in somewhere like Enceladus, but it's just really making the point that around these sites there is abundant energy for life. So we see spectacular abundances and biomasses of organisms around these hydrothermal vents. And you'll see in a second, as this camera pans back, just what I mean by abundant life. Okay, all of this is crabs, basically. Okay, so these are Yeti crabs, a new species which has just been described from around these vents on the East Scotia Ridge.
May I ask again what depth this is?
This is about 2,400 metres, about 2.5 kilometres. What's that?
How big is a crab?
Oh, about 17 centimetres carapace length maximum, so that's probably about that big.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's just to make the point really that, you know, there is abundant energy around these sites for life. So if life occurs, the biomass can be really quite staggering. In this case, these animals actually farm symbiotic bacteria on the setae on their ventral surface. So just to point out that most of the vents that we've investigated so far are basically located in ocean spreading centres. So essentially they're magmatic. They're associated with magma chambers lying underneath the ocean ridges. And as a result of that, they do have a specific chemistry. It does vary, but generally these vents are acidic. You can see pHs here. Between about 2.9 and 3.4 or thereabouts, and their temperatures are high. In the case of the vents I've just shown you, about 386 degrees C. I think, Doug, the ones you've looked at are up to about 500 degrees C. About 430. Okay, so these are very hot, they're acidic, and the chemistry I think is probably, you know, pretty ferocious in terms of thinking about possible genus of life. What's much more interesting and what's now being discussed as a potential or having conditions quite similar to those on Hadean Earth that may have given rise to life here are what are called alkaline hydrothermal vents. And this is the main site that's been investigated, Lost City, which lies about 15 kilometres from the spreading axis of the mid-Atlantic ridge. You can see here that the chemistry immediately and the physical conditions are very different to these sort of magmatic hydrothermal vents. We have lower temperatures, 40 to about 90 degrees C, alkaline chemistry, pH about 9 to 9.8. They occur quite shallow, in this case 700 to 800 metres, and the whole chemistry around these things, the whole geochemistry, is very different. So we see evidence of serpentinisation here, generating lots of hydrogen and lots of methane in the vent fluids from these types of vents. And this is coming from the hydration reaction of olivine in warm conditions underneath the surface of the seabed. So, of course, there's been lots of discussions about the origin of life. So we've seen things like the prebiotic soup hypothesis by Haldane. But one of the most popular ideas at the moment seems to be this idea that it was conditions like those around Lost City that actually may have given a rise to life on Earth. What's the reason for that? Well, these vents seem to give rise to very exotic chemistry, which is very, very rich in organic chemicals. So you can see here basically in the presence of iron nickel sulfide, greigite, CO2 and CO are reduced to CH4. This seems to be a comparable reaction to some of the most primitive metabolic pathways we see in microorganisms existing today, things like acetogens and methanogens, basically that they use to generate ATP. Greigite seems to have a similar structure to the active centres of some of the most primitive enzymes involved in these reactions. So things like ferredoxin, acetyl coenzyme A, and carbon monoxide dehydrogenase. So there seems to be a sort of mineral analogues of biological molecules in this environment. Also, you see natural pH ionic gradients from the alkaline vent fluids that are surrounding seawater that could be seen as the basis of a proton pump. The other thing is there's lots of interesting surfaces around these vents, bubbles, for example, which are formed by iron sulfide that can act as reaction surfaces for the reactions that generate these organic molecules. And of course, things like these bubbles can also concentrate the products of reactions as well. So there's been a thought line that perhaps we're looking almost at an analogue of the first cells here, but in this case mineral cells rather than things with cell membranes. So where might we find similar conditions to these alkaline vents elsewhere in the solar system? Well, I've really looked at the two sort of topics in the title of our meeting, Europa and Enceladus, in this context. So Europa, well, both of these moons seem old enough in terms of the length of time it's taken life to evolve on Earth. They seem old enough for life to have evolved associated with those moons. Water is often viewed as a prerequisite for life, and we clearly have evidence of water in both of these moons. So in the case of Europa, it seems to have an ice shell which could be anywhere between 1 to 40 kilometres thick, depending on whose papers you're reading. There seems to be water venting at the pole, and there have been estimates that the ocean on Europa is somewhere between 70 to 160 kilometres in depth. pH, there's a lot of controversy about this, but there has been suggestion that the water is acidic, and possibly a brine which is rich in magnesium chloride, sodium chloride and potassium chloride. Now there were thoughts that it was in fact rich in magnesium sulfate, but the radiation environment on the surface of Europa is so harsh that it's thought that this is basically a radiation product. There's probably hydrothermalism going on, and this may be related to some of the surface chaos features that are seen on the surface ice of Europa, but those features could be being generated by other mechanisms as well. In the case of Enceladus, again, there's a nice water layer, perhaps 80 to 100 kilometres thick. Liquid water, which seems to be located under the south polar terrain, could be up to 10 kilometres thick. So actually a similar depth to the deepest places on Earth. The pH is thought to be alkaline. It's thought to be salty, maybe around 4%. In terms of its salinity, and there's evidence of hydrothermal venting of the alkaline type. And this is from some relatively new research which has found nanoparticles of silicate basically all, in the E ring around Saturn, and the mechanism for formation of that seems to be, or the only mechanism found on Earth is that associated with serpentinization and this low temperature venting. In the fluids that are emanating from Enceladus, as was said by the previous speaker, there's lots of carbon dioxide, ammonia, methane and other larger organic molecules as well. So this is a very interesting place to look at. So a bit more detail on Europa. Water vapour detected in 200 kilometre plumes at the South Pole. These are likely to be related to gravitationally forced tides and the obliquity of the orbit. And then we've got these chaos features, as I said, these large areas of fractured ice. As I said, it's thought they may be being driven by hydrothermal plumes, but it's possible that they're simply being driven by ice dynamics on that moon. Enceladus, these lovely pictures showing the jets of gas basically emanating from one of the poles of the moon here. These are coming out at something like 450 meters per second. They contain, as I said, water, CO2, methane, ammonia, salt, and these silicate particles, and there's evidence of serpentinization and hydrothermalism. And this is a model for what a sort of cross-section for what Enceladus might look like on the surface at this polar region where we're getting these jets of liquid. So basically a liquid sea, some form of hydrothermal circulation going on, and plumes involved in this process of jetting. So how do we find vents on Earth? Well, this is the really low-cost, cheap and nasty method of finding vents. Basically, you take a giant pond dipper and you go around dipping in the ocean looking for the plumes from these hydrothermal vents. And you have an array of sensors on these things, transmissometers, sensors for redox potential, trace elements are of great interest in finding these things, and of course multi-beam sonar for looking at the shape of the seabed, and finally visual confirmation. We can now do this much more efficiently using AUVs, automated underwater vehicles. I've spent many a week doing this along with Doug and Andy in the audience. There are photographs of several of us asleep in front of the monitors while we're doing this. The problem with finding these vents is that they are actually vanishingly small in a very big ocean at great depth. So finding them in the ocean of an exoplanet is going to be incredibly difficult. But this paper was actually just published on Thursday, and I think gives some room for hope with this. This is showing the detection of iron now from hydrothermal vents on the East Pacific Rise, Southern East Pacific Rise, and now we've been able to detect iron and a number of other chemical signatures from these vents up to 4,000 kilometres from the vents. So this is quite encouraging, I think, in the context of what we're thinking about today. So a few thoughts about searching for life in these two situations, Europa and Enceladus. Europa, I think, is quite difficult. Hydrothermalism is present, but there are suggestions that it's high temperature. The ocean chemistry suggested is not comparable with what we see around Lost City, perhaps the Hadean Earth. There's very high surface radiation on this moon, which means that taking surface samples to detect signatures of life is really not feasible. And that's because the radiation simply busts up anything that's going to be left behind by life on the surface. Drilling into the ice and finding signatures a few metres down may be a different matter. There is a thin oxygen atmosphere around Europa because of radiation basically splitting water, and it's going to require landing and boring into ice. So this is a pretty hazardous looking terrain for a landing vehicle. It's going to need lots of power and so on. Enceladus might be an easier option. Conditions appear to be more similar to Lost City type conditions, and of course you've got the possibility of a flyby to sample this vented material. The slight issue here is that material dilutes in space very, very rapidly, so getting sufficient material is potentially going to be an issue. Landing and boring is possible, but there are similar hazards to Europa, I would guess. We'll probably hear more about that later today. So if life does exist, say on Enceladus, where's it going to be and what's it going to be like? Well, it's likely to be located around low temperature events if they're there. But what we're finding now on Earth is that chemosynthetic microorganisms are being found in many, many other places throughout the ocean. So if life has evolved, I think we can probably safely assume that it's not just going to be around vent localities. It may be associated with particles in the water column, possibly under the ice, and in all sorts of other places on those in those localities. Would we expect multicellularity? Well, possibly not. Basically, the first signs on Earth in terms of cellular differentiation was about 3 to 3.5 billion years ago. First evidence of cell differentiation 2 billion years ago. Multicellular eukaryotes about 1 billion years ago. Metazoan diversification something in the order of 700 million years ago. So it may be that these moons and conditions on them suitable for formation of life simply haven't been around for long enough for this to happen. But I mean, there are ginormous question marks around this. Just a quick thought elsewhere in the solar system, Titan, really remarkable pictures from a lander here. Here we've got liquid hydrocarbons instead of water. So there is plenty of redox energy in the form of organic molecules such as acetylene, but I think if life did originate here, then we'd be thinking about a very, very different chemistry of life to that on Earth, something which probably would be pretty difficult to recognise potentially. So to summarise, chemosynthetic environments do have a highly specialised fauna that mainly relies on chemical energy, and that chemical energy is generally utilised by bacteria. All the other organisms around those vents are either eating those bacteria or symbiotic with them. The most important reduced compounds in chemosynthetic environments on Earth are thermogenic hydrogen sulfide and methane, but often these are oxidised using oxygen. In the deep subsurface biosphere and alkaline vents, in ultramafic settings, there's more of a reliance on hydrogen and methane as sources of energy. Enceladus has evidence of alkaline low temperature venting and these quite chemical rich fluids emanating from these jets. Titan and Europa are also candidates, but Titan does have this very different chemistry to anything we see on Earth at the moment. So this is a big challenge, and that's all I wanted to say. Any questions? Yeah, Jeff.
So the chemosynthetic reactions, still many of those electron donors and acceptors ultimately are linked into an oxidized earth and the rise of oxygen, things like sulfate. So is there, can you calculate the potential productivity on a planet where there hasn't been oxygenic photosynthesis and where your redox couples really are just only from rocks or from the material delivered from the outside?
Yeah, I should think you would be able to, but I haven't done the calculation. I'm not sure whether.
Do you think that's a limitation, though, in using vents as an analogue for truly understanding these extraterrestrial environments?
It may be, but I mean the processes that are forming vent fluids at Lost City seem to be quite similar to those which have been suggested for Enceladus. So I'd expect the chemistry to be quite similar in that case. It's certainly not similar with sort of magmatic venting, because there, I mean, the main sort of energetic chemistry is coming from hydrogen sulfide, for example, and oxygen is being used to oxidise that. There may be some quite interesting analogues to look at in terms of the deep biosphere on Earth at the moment. I mean, life has now been found down to 1.8 kilometres below seabed. In that case, there's coal there, so basically, there's a rich source of carbon energy, which is ultimately derived from the surface. But there are other environments there associated with less carbon-rich environments, which would probably be worth looking at.